We have a massive Toronto Raptors trade update to discuss as Shams of The Athletic as well as Bleacher Report came out with a lot of information regarding the Toronto Raptors trade deadline, including two potential free agent suitors for Fred VanVleet, which will have a big impact on whether or not he'll get moved at this deadline. We also had a rumored package about Gary Trent Jr. potentially going to the Charlotte Hornets for a very interesting package back in return for the Raptors. We've also been linked to 3 centers out here on the market before, that February 9th deadline is upon us, and a whole bunch more. So we'll dive into all that in this video. Let's dive into the first topic of discussion. The first thing we're taking a look at is the Suns and Magic. Potential free agent suitors for Fred VanVleet. Being free agent suitors for Fred VanVleet. And two of the big topics heading into this year's trade deadline is what the heck is going to happen with our two guys that could be unrestricted free agents this summer. Both Fred VanVleet and Gary Trent Jr. have player options that they're likely to turn down this offseason, meaning they could leave the Toronto Raptors for nothing in return this summer if we don't trade them right now or are assured that they're going to extend and re-sign with this team. So those are big decisions Masai Ujiri has to have. And now, even with Fred VanVleet's struggles this season, there are going to be teams out there interested in picking him up. And now we have some insight into what those teams are, what they'd be willing to spend, and what that impact has on whether or not Fred VanVleet gets dealt. And the first part is coming from Shams, saying that the Suns and the Magic have emerged as potential free agent suitors for all-star guard Fred VanVleet. He goes on to say that the 2019 NBA champion, one of the league's greatest undrafted success stories, spoke recently about his pending free agency, which we discussed on this on the channel, saying that I'm completely focused on this team, my loyalty to this team and to the franchise, trying to get us back to the level we're accustomed to being around here. So that's what Fred VanVleet is saying. We all know that he's a guy that sort of wants to stay. He re-signed up with us. He re-upped with the Toronto Raptors. And even with all the criticism and stuff, this is a guy that really gave everything out there on the court to win us that 2019 NBA championship. And he's a guy that, whether the shots are going in or not, he's playing 110% out there on the court, playing through injuries and stuff. So even with all the criticism, right, Fred VanVleet is still fully engaged, fully focused in on this Toronto Raptors team. But that doesn't mean the Raptors might not trade him. As coming from Bleacher Report, they gave us some insight into what money he could be making this offseason, saying that they're ballparking Fred VanVleet's next salary at $30 to $35 million, above the threshold that he currently could have been extended this past summer, but the length of the contract will be of note. Kyle Lowry, before him, did sign a 3-year, $100 million agreement with the Toronto Raptors in 2017-2018 season at 31 years old. So, Fisher out here is Bleacher Report. They're out here linking Fred VanVleet's contract, similar to what Kyle Lowry ended up receiving from the Toronto Raptors at a similar age and really in a similar point in their careers. Kyle Lowry at that point, has had his ups and downs in the playoffs. Definitely was dealing with some injuries, some playoff just fall offs. There's no other way to put it, even though I think Kyle Lowry's was more so due to just getting hurt due to the war of attrition he had to go through every single season. But Fred VanVleet, given his performance this year, his stats aren't up to his usual standards. Right, 18 points per game and 6 assists wouldn't be too bad, but the efficiency, 33% from behind the three-point line, 38% from the field, just isn't too hot. So, as a lot of Toronto Raptors fans not willing to give Fred VanVleet a big pay raise this offseason, and $30 to $35 million would certainly be a lot of money that the Toronto Raptors be forking out. Now, the Suns, the Magic are two teams that could definitely use Fred VanVleet. Suns have an aging point guard themselves in Chris Paul, who obviously is an NBA legend, but they don't want to prematurely close the championship window of Devin Booker and DeAndre Ayton, even though things aren't looking too hot this season, with Devin Booker missing a bunch of weeks throughout this year. And then the Orlando Magic at some point probably want to take the leap forward and bring in some vets to put around guys like Franz and Paolo and Wendell Carter Jr. So we'll see what ends up happening if those two teams end up acquiring. But those are also two teams that could end up giving a bag to Fred VanVleet this summer. So could they get dealt? Could we prematurely move him before he potentially leaves for nothing? Well, this chunk also gives us some insight into other players, but could the Raptors ultimately decide to trade Siakam? Anything is possible, musical chairs. This talks about a bunch of stuff, but Toronto is only expected to seriously listen to offers for Gary Trent Jr., sources said. Fred VanVleet's apparent trade candidacy seems to be far more rooted in his down performance this season as the smaller guard approaches his 2019th birthday, rather than the front office's willingness to part with such a central team leader. So that's all the stuff regarding Fred VanVleet, at least in that quote, right? Gary's going to be the guy which we're talking about in the next segment, but Fred VanVleet doesn't seem like a guy that's going to be dealt, even with all that free agent implication, which I know a lot of people in the comment section are going to be frustrated with, because that means the Raptors will likely fork over a $30+ million contract to Fred this summer, which is a lot of money for our smaller point guard that, sure, I'm still of the belief that Fred VanVleet can turn around on offense. The defense is what's really scared me this season. So we'll see what ends up happening on that front with Fred VanVleet. Also, to just go on with that, meanwhile, the Raptors officials have also left rival front offices with the impression that it would take a haul, at least in the ballpark of Atlanta's offseason price for DeJounte Murray, multiple unprotected first-round picks for Toronto to even consider parting ways with OG Anunoby, a known favorite of Masai Ujiri. So don't expect, unless a massive package comes back for OG Anunoby, that he will get dealt. It seems like every article I read, they've said every single team in the NBA would try to acquire OG Anunoby if he was available there for a trade. So we'll see what ends up happening, but lots of stuff to potentially go down this deadline. We got more to discuss in this video, but if you have some pretty solid predictions, if you're sold on something will happen, will not happen, definitely check out the CoolBet app using the link down in the description below to check out some bets on specifically regarding this trade deadline, about Pascal Siakam, what team he could potentially be on post this trade deadline, Fred VanVleet, Gary Trent Jr., OG Anunoby, and if you don't think they're going anywhere, you can bet on that as well and make yourself a few bucks if you're sure on them not getting dealt, because you can pick the Raptors to be their team post trade deadline or another team. CoolBet's a sportsbook that are regulated in Ontario. They're available all across Canada. They're safe to use, and they got bets for every single Raptors game, NBA game, really anything in general, including all these trades. So shout out to CoolBet for supporting the podcast. If you are interested in sports betting, definitely use them as their sportsbook and use our link down in the description below. But the next thing we're taking a look at is Gary Trent Jr. to the Hornets. Now, this one is a trade proposal that came out, a rumor, like a trade discussion, not just a random throw it out trade proposal by a random YouTuber or anything like that. Jake Fisher of Bleacher Report indicated that the Toronto Raptors have been in discussions with the Charlotte Hornets, saying that Toronto has shown interest in Hornets forward Jalen McDaniels, sources have said. Charlotte's fourth-year forward would fit in with the same bill that Gary Trent Jr. did 2 years ago. He is set to reach unrestricted free agency this summer, where teams are projecting McDaniels to command a far lower salary than Gary Trent, roughly $10 million per season, in the ballpark of a full non-taxpayer mid-level exception. So that's what he's saying in regards to a potential return for Gary Trent Jr. And look, Jalen McDaniels is cool. He's a guy that fits the Toronto Raptors mold as a player, and if you look at the salaries that would have to come back, it would likely have to be Kelly Oubre added to that deal as well. And two of those guys, I'll dive in those stats before I give my opinion. Right, Jalen McDaniels this season, he's 6'9", 11 points per game, 5 rebounds, 2 assists, plays solid defense, can knock down the three-point shot at 36%. He gets a steal per night, 46% from the field, but again, nothing really special. And as I've talked about on this podcast, would be these types of players. He's like a Juancho Hernangomez. Like, he's better than Juancho, but like very redundant in terms of skills that he would provide to this Toronto Raptors team. Sure, it'd be cool. Sure, we're bought into the 6'9" lineup, but we're giving away our best shooter, our most consistent three-point shooter, for a guy that really is going to fill, at best, a Chris Boucher mold, a Thaddeus Young mold with a little bit better jump shot. Like, that's not great. Sure, he's 24, 25, so there's room to grow, and he's been developing on that Hornets team that doesn't have their usual power forward in Myles Bridges. But for Gary Trent Jr., a guy that we dealt Norman Powell away for, like, that is ugly. Obviously, having a Kelly Oubre added too, who's an unrestricted free agent as well this summer, at 20 points per game, 5 rebounds would be cool, but again, he can't really shoot threes. He's more of an isolation scorer, and by all accounts, even though he's putting up a really solid stat line, every team that's had Kelly Oubre Jr., their fans have just said he's not really a winning basketball player. So if that's a return for a Gary Trent Jr. package, unless Masai Ujiri sees something that I don't, and Jalen McDaniels and all that sort of stuff, then that is an ugly, ugly return for a guy in Gary Trent Jr. that I'd love to keep on this Toronto Raptors team and, end up paying and keeping around. So if that's a deal that ends up going down, that would be very, very disappointing for this Toronto Raptors squad. And I think so in the this is coming from Shams of The Athletic, saying that Trent appears to be the most likely Toronto Raptor to be traded, as Mark Stein reported, and various rival executives are under the impression Toronto will even search to move Trent before this trade deadline, as Trent is positioned to decline his $18.5 million option to test free agency, with early indications that Trent will be seeking upwards of $25 million per year before the 2023-2024 campaign begins. Now, that is a lot of money. A lot of money that would be forked out for Gary Trent Jr. And as we said, we have guys like Pascal Siakam. We have guys like OG Anunoby who are going to be commanding and currently command pretty substantial contracts. Scotty Barnes is someone you have to plan your future around, making sure there's money for to be provided to him. Obviously, for giving Fred VanVleet $30 million a summer, there's not a lot of enough bread to really go around, especially if Gary Trent Jr. is making $25+ million. So would you guys like to see Gary be given that contract? Let me know in the comment section below. The next thing we're discussing is Jakob Poeltl Raptors rumors pick back up. And this has been a talk this season, as Jakob Poeltl is a guy that was a former Toronto Raptor, plays the center position, and now Shams had a lot of his article. He did a big piece in The Athletic with a lot of Raptors news in it, and took a large chunk of it regarding Jakob Poeltl update. And basically in this article, he had to say that every deadline as a key hub for the entire NBA. This season, the San Antonio Spurs center Jakob Poeltl has gained some significant trade interest from teams such as the Toronto Raptors and Boston Celtics, according to league sources. Like all the other sources in this story, were generated by anonymity so that they would be able to speak freely. Poeltl is believed to have great respect for the Spurs organization and Greg Popovich and his teammates, but his desire to compete on the highest levels is a factor that other organizations feel is important in the pending unrestricted free agency. Because Jakob Poeltl, like the other guys we've discussed, is a free agent this summer. The Spurs wanted the 27-year-old Poeltl to be a part of the long-term future, but are balancing the risk of his price tag and potentially losing him for nothing this summer. The Spurs have a standing offer for Poeltl with a maximum extension of $58 million per year over 4 seasons since before the season, but that has been declined, as obviously he's going to make more money. So he's slated to have an excess of $50 million in salary cap. So Poeltl will approach the $20 million per year range in a new deal during this offseason. There's no question the Spurs would hold a high price threshold in any deal involving Jakob Poeltl. So apparently Poeltl, the two things to take away from is that we're competing with the Boston Celtics to potentially acquire Jakob Poeltl, and the price tag is high if we are trying to acquire the San Antonio Spurs center. And, you know, he's an interesting piece. I mean, you look at his stats for this year, he's solid, right? He's a proper solid big man, 12 points, 9 rebounds, efficient from the field, not much of a jump shot. He blocks a few things, plays good defense, but, you know, Spurs want a big package in return for Jakob Poeltl. They just want They want a significant return, as the article essentially says. They're capable of paying Jakob Poeltl this summer. So, you know, if we do end up acquiring him, are we going to give him that $20 million per year? What will we give back to the San Antonio Spurs? That all remains to be seen. But we've heard the Poeltl rumors a bunch. But the Toronto Raptors are trying to win now. Then Poeltl could be a nice piece. But we might have to give up too much and end up to acquiring him, where we're just a middle-of-the-pack team. And if we end up giving a first-round pick to acquire Jakob Poeltl, that's a yikes. That's a yikes, given how this season's going. But the final thing we're discussing in this video is Myles Turner and DeAndre Ayton on the Raptors' radar. This, again, is also coming from Bleacher Report. But basically, as we've all known, it seems like weekly at this point, Myles Turner has been linked to the Toronto Raptors. Let's get this article there. Or is this the one? I don't even have the image. It's so well known that the Toronto Raptors are interested in Myles Turner. I didn't even have to bring it up. But basically, we're interested, according to Bleacher Report, in Myles Turner, DeAndre Ayton. We've talked about them ad nauseum over the course of the season. DeAndre Ayton would be cool, but again, I'm not even sure if he's eligible to be traded, or at least he has a no trade clause, at least post January 15th. The Suns are in a little bit of a tumultuous situation. Could they give us DeAndre Ayton for Fred VanVleet? That would be a deal I wouldn't turn my head to. I think that would be a nice package for the Toronto Raptors. I don't know if the Suns do that, but let me know your potential packages for Poeltl, Myles Turner, DeAndre in the comment section below. But folks, you guys are the best for making this far. Subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. Check out the Cool Bet Sportsbook. Helps us out big time using the link down below. Anyways, I'm signing out. Cheers.